everyone, and welcome to video 2 of our social psychology unit. Last video we talked a bit about how we assess behaviors as a result in relation to people's traits and the situation. Well, now we are going to look at conformity, and this is kind of going to expand on those topics because others and how we perceive their actions can influence our actions in turn. And just before we get started, I want to explain to you the difference between conformity, obedience, and compliance. Conformity is fitting in with a group, even if you do not want to go along with the group. Obedience is basically doing a behavior that you're told from an authority figure. And compliance is complying or executing an action. So just to make sure there are differentiations based on the social situation. And so what we're going to do with this unit is we want to be able to explain the Asch effect, a famous study in conformity. I think it was in the 1950s. Define conformity and the types of social influence, Stanley Milgram's experiment, and groupthink, different group processes that result. So when we talk about conformity, we're talking about the tendency to act and think like the people around us, even if we don't agree with the group. Now, based on how we situate ourselves, we tend to conform and adopt the attitudes of the people around us, including political issues, religious issues, lifestyle choices, even diet, all of these things. And this is kind of involved with the chameleon effect. If you've ever noticed that maybe you start using some certain slang or emojis and then your friends start using it in the similar way or vice versa. This is a chameleon effect. We kind of mimic what is said to us as a way to kind of reciprocate and build a relationship, build some camaraderie. Well, people conform for usually two reasons. It's going to be generalized to two reasons. A normative influence and an informational influence. So basically one is just, are we fitting the norm, feeling good and being accepted? And two, we go along with the group because we believe they have some information that we are not privy to, but they are correct. And so you see, this is where we can kind of break that down further, maybe informational influence and political parties, for example, or normative influence for style of dress or all these different things. Whatever type of issue or fad you can think of, keto diets, vegetarianism, LGBT community, and the norms surrounding that, as well as, religious. These are all different types of influences, and based on your purpose for joining or going with the group, maybe you trust that this group has your best interests at heart. And sometimes they do. It's not always a malicious thing. Sometimes they do have your best interests at heart, and that's why we build those groups. But a normative influence, kind of just going with the flow to make sure that we are comfortable in that scenario, this was first discussed by Solomon Asch. We have severe concern about what others think about us as social creatures. It's just normal. So back in 1956, Solomon Asch conducted an experiment where he had a group of people who were kind of all in on the game, except the participant, the one person. And he wanted to test if the person would conform under social pressure. So this would be if he had 13 people assessing whether line X matched best with line A, B, or C in this picture. Now he had it so that all 12 Confederates, he called them, because they were kind of like traitors to the study, he had the Confederates all say the wrong answer because he wanted to see if he could build that pressure to see if that unknowing participant would change their response based on that normative influence. And majority of the times they did. They would say a wrong answer even if they knowingly knew it was wrong. So if the whole group said, no, line A matches best with line X, that participant usually went with line A. Oops. I'm sorry. And so that fitting in can lead to camaraderie and compliments and feeling good and safe within our group. So what factors make us more likely to conform? The size of the majority. Now this is a tricky line. The size has to be big enough to where we feel pressure, but not so big that we feel anonymity within numbers. So it's kind of somewhere in the middle. The presence of another dissenter. This is always important and why you should be the first person to speak up sometimes. Because a lot of times people feel pressured like they shouldn't speak up because they're the only one. But if you start having one dissenter, there's a video on YouTube of a guy dancing. It's called like just as important as a leader is the first follower. And this guy's dancing. He gets a bunch of people to dance in public. That person kind of shows that, hey, there are differences in thought. We can break from the group. We can have a diversity of thought. So the presence of another dissenter is very important. That makes people less likely to conform. And the public or private nature of the response. There's a movie, very old movie, called 12 Angry Men. It perfectly personifies how social psychology works. It's based on the trial of a murderer. And it's basically what goes on in the jury room. It's one of those, I think it's an old movie, like 50s or 40s, 50s. But it shows that when people voice their opinions, if you ask this question about the lines, like Solomon Ash did, had people say out loud, it creates more pressure. But if I had each participant write down on an anonymous piece of paper what they thought, they may be more likely to go with their true thought as opposed to the group. So private voting is very important, and that's why we use it in the United States political system. And probably why you're not allowed to have voting paraphernalia or memorabilia within 100 feet of whatever building you're voting in, because we're trying to account for those conformity kind of things. And then we have the informational influence. We trust people as a source of information. We think they have some information we don't know or we're not privy to. And so we're conforming to what society dictates sometimes. We rely on those descriptive norms. We act the way most others act, especially in new situations. Let's say you go into a church, a Catholic church, and you're going to a mass with your friend because I asked you to go, but you're not Catholic. You have no idea what's going on. You subscribe to those descriptive norms to help you get through the process and kind of follow along with the rituals out of respect for that faith. So maybe you stand up when you stand up, kneel when they kneel, shake hands when they shake hands, all of those things. So we act how most others act because they have some kind of information we don't know, like you're watching. Sometimes these norms are misperceived. We rely on flawed notions, and the best example is college drinking. Sometimes we look to other people and say, hey, maybe they have information we don't know. I'm looking at this descriptive norms, and, everything I've heard is that people drink in excess in college. And that is actually not true. But because of the way it's perpetuated in media and how people kind of carry on these notions, it seems like it's more prevalent than it is. And so sometimes those things that are perceived as a norm aren't exactly a norm. Maybe your norm is studying, staying up all night and doing whatever else, or studying and maybe going to a party or two, but not every weekend in excess, right? Descriptive norms have power. There's an influence of multitudes of behaviors, from energy use to fitness. Because we think that something is a norm and we should be abiding by it, we kind of press ourselves to conform to it. Now Stanley Milgram, back in 1963, and Philip Zimbardo. Philip Zimbardo and Stanley Milgram were actually contemporaries, and I only found this out like a few months ago, and I just oh my gosh, how did I miss this? They went to high school together, and then anyway, I think it's so cool. Then they met up after their research because they have two of the most infamous psychological studies. But they both, we're going to talk about both of their studies in conformity, and I have a video on the next slide which gives you an example of Stanley Milgram's experiment. It's a really good explanation of how he conducted it. But back in the day, Milgram wanted to look into why did the Nazis commit the atrocities of the Holocaust? Why did they commit mass genocide? Just because Hitler told them to? Well, a lot of people at the time were saying, well, it's because German people are evil. That's why. Dispositional attribution. Well, Milgram wanted to say, no, I think there are other situational forces at work here, and that I could convince everyday Americans to do the same things, commit some of the same atrocities, and even murder someone. And so he looked at the power of authority, that perceived power and the power dynamics in the situation. So he did a learning and memory study to test obedience to authority, if people would comply just because they were told to, because that was a lot of the response of the German soldiers when they were put on the Nuremberg trials. Why did you do this? Because that's what I was ordered. And so we're looking deeper into that. So why did you do it just because you were ordered? And that's what we're looking at with obedience to authority. That perceived authority makes us feel pressured to comply. And so he set up this whole fake study with fake learners and a fake and our teacher who was the participant. And basically, if they got the memory task wrong, he would zap them. The teacher had to zap the person. Eventually, it was actually a tape and not a real person. It was a recording. So eventually, the person would stop reacting as if they passed out or died. And the electrical shock you could see varied to like warning, death at the end. And some teachers would keep doing the task just because the scientist, just a person in white lab coat, said, you have to complete the task. You have to complete the experiment. And so we see that some people did oblige to that obedience. They obeyed the authority, and some people didn't. And so this is a very controversial study. Obviously, having someone realize that they could potentially kill someone just because they were listening to a random stranger they thought was an authority figure could be very controversial. But we learned a lot of information from it, so it's kind of like, ooh, what do we do? But yeah, here's a nice video that more fully explains Milgram's obedience study. It is like a TV show kind of adaptation, so it's not an actual like documentary or scientific. They kind of recreated it, but elements are the same. And so 65% of people continued to administer shocks. Men and women equally obeyed. Obedience decreased when the learner was in the same room as the experimenter, because then you can kind of see them. It creates that personalization. Anonymity does wondrous, horrible things to the way that people behave. Like you kind of see this online. People are keyboard warriors, say all this mean crap and bullying online. But when it comes face to face, they probably wouldn't do it, right? So contact and proximity are big influencing factors in social psychology, as well as physicality, actually touching someone, and seeing other teachers refuse, the whole idea of the other dissenters. Again, it's very controversial because it was stressful. This was a pervasive time of prejudice and dehumanization, but they did follow up with participants to make sure that psychologically they were well adjusted. Okay, so to watch this video, you're going to have to click the link to watch it on YouTube because there is some kind of nudity, because it's a video of the Stanford prison experiment conducted by Philip Zimbardo, because while his study kind of looked at the roles of like obedience to authority, it also looked at social roles, social norms, and scripts. So basically he recruited a bunch of college students to role play as prison guards and prisoners. And he believed that eventually, because of the powerful ideas we have and concepts surrounding social roles and social norms and how prison guards should behave and how prisoners should behave, that these groups would respectively fall into their different areas and act according to kind of the expectation. Well, the study got so out of hand that they had to stop it early. But they did find some very interesting results, so make sure you watch this film. And this is a nice chart that kind of looks at the differences in social influence that can result from conforming to different groups, in-groups, out-groups, all that stuff we're going to talk about in the next video. But we are influenced by the people around us more than we recognize. And while each person's unique and makes choices, we live in a social world where what we do reflects the people we encounter. So, even if you're not actively conscious of how they're shaping you, it's still maybe on an unconscious or lower level of consciousness. So it's good to try to be aware of how these different influences may be overtaking you. Stay tuned for part 3.